Shifting gears, you thought that this was a conference about the human microbiome. I'm here to give you another example. And the brief caveat that we're not supposed to have to give, this was much longer and now it's much shorter, and I left out lots of good stuff, so you can ask about that later if you like. Okay. Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus presents the rhizome, those subterranean life forms like bulbs and tubers, as model and map for multiplicities that have no beginning and no end. Rhizomes are distinguished in their account by being neither the one nor the multiple, linked instead to multiplicities as a relational process of becoming. Furthermore, rhizomes contrast absolutely in this schema with roots and with trees, metaphors for the dominant order and classificatory hierarchy. We don't like trees, Deleuze and Guattari tell us. This is a direct quote, page 50. We should stop believing in trees, roots, and radicals. Those are embryos of roots. Grapevines are deeply rooted perennials. Though varieties of the domesticated wine grape, Vitis vinifera, have traveled widely with their human caretakers over the past 8,000 years of wine's recorded history through trade, conquest, and migration. I'd like to begin this introduction to wine's multiple microbiomes with a promise to speak on behalf of roots and their tree-like microbial allies, and then to offer some thoughts about how the scientific magic of biodynamic viticulture and of compost might offer occasion for hope in the face of environmental insults from agrochemicals and from climate change. First, a few words about wine's microbiomes. To begin with, what microbiologists poetically call microbial consortia and biogeographies are indispensable to our understanding of wine in two distinctive locales, the vineyard and the cellar. Before Louis Pasteur's work in the latter 19th century, the transformative magic of fermentation was thought to be a strictly chemical process, abiotic. As we know, thanks to Bruno Latour, Pasteur and the emerging science of microbiology put the spotlight on the concerted engagements of yeasts, enzymes, and bacteria, which together transform sugar into alcohol, gas, or acids. The biochemistry of the wine cellar involves complex interactions, both microorganismal and physiochemical, which I can only begin to introduce here. This is why this was once a much longer paper. I got very excited about them. These engagements, in which yeast, fungi, and bacteria assist, commingle with, or devour one another, occur throughout the fermentation process and can affect the hygienic and organoleptic qualities of wine. Grapes, their pulp, and wine itself show a wide array of yeast and bacterial biodiversity, constituting a dynamic microbial ecosystem comprised of different species and strains interacting at different moments in time. Human manipulations of known fermentation mechanisms, such as the selection of yeast to launch fermentation, or the addition of sulfur dioxide for hygiene and transport stability, have been the subject of sometimes feisty debate, which I would love to have had the time to talk about more here, but anon. Switching now from the cellar to the vineyard, I want to give particular attention to the microbiota of the vineyard soil. As promised, I'm eager to make the case on behalf of roots and trees, both of which figure prominently in vineyard microbiology. The grapevine, of course, is a perennial, deeply rooted in place and sensitive to climate, soil type, and the other local specificities that characterize terroir. Grapevines are certainly not rhizomes, but neither are they rooted in isolation. Indeed, they participate in lively microbial assemblages in what's known as the Rhizosphere. Oh, that, by the way, an errant slide. This is a grapevine that looks like a tree. It's a 400-year-old wine grapevine in North Carolina. But here we have the rhizosphere, its roots and trees. So the rhizosphere, we'll come back to in just a second. In her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, Anna Tsing offers us a vibrantly rhizomatic account of the dynamic local-global relations linking the Matsutake mushroom, its pine tree hosts, and their sometimes ally, the oak tree, along with human interlocutors in disrupted landscapes, entangled in what she refers to as the possibility of life in the capitalist ruins. Trees occupy symbiotic or commensal positions in this multi-species terrain, redemptive figures that, one would hope, Deleuze and Guattari might grow to like. The grapevine's rhizosphere is a lively interstitial zone just a few millimeters thick, surrounding its deep roots and linking them via microorganismal activity to the surrounding soil, what's known as the bulk soil. Among the bacteria and fungi, many beneficial, some pathogenic, that inhabit the root's rhizosphere is a microscopic fungal tree that acts as a prosthetic for the root. On the inset on the right side of the slide, we see an image, you might be able to read it, labeled AMF for arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus. The AMF penetrates the root and extends the root's functional capacities to seek nutrients from the surrounding soil. Arbuscle means little tree, and the mycorrhiza refers to a symbiotic relationship between fungi and plant, in which the fungus extends its agile, single-celled filaments out beyond the root in search of plant nutrients, with the fungus in return receiving sugar from the root. Just in case you're not bedazzled enough by the rhizosphere's appropriation of arboreal microorganismal prostheses, consider this. Basque scientist Irate Zara-Ona India and her Chicago colleague Jack Gilbert have identified what they describe as microbial terroirs for wine grapes. These microbial communities are not only specific to particular locales where a wine grape is grown, stunningly, they've shown that each part of the plant, leaves, flowers, bark, and grapes, is a microhabitat, each with its own distinctive assemblage of bacteria and fungi. Jack Gilbert is also one of the lead scientists spearheading the Earth Microbiome Project, or as I prefer to call it, the More Than Human Microbiome Project, a worthy antidote to human exceptionalism and the anthropocentric view that the microbiome resides entirely within the human gut. Over the centuries, but especially in the late capitalist era, viticulture has successively reduced biodiversity through selective breeding of a small number of varieties among the thousands of available wine grapes, through intensive monoculture, and following World Wars I and II, through the increasingly widespread use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, a byproduct of wartime chemical industries. Wine grapes are also temperature sensitive, growing in a relatively narrow band of temperate climates on either side of the equator, thus making them especially vulnerable to climate change. Biodynamic viticulture is one approach, a distinctive amalgam of scientific and spiritual approaches that some see as a source of support for ameliorating and sustaining the health of vineyard soils and vines. And very briefly, this is a pit full of cow horns stuffed with manure from lactating cows that will be buried for a season and transformed into microbially active humus. It makes what's called PrEP 500 in the biodynamic array of homeopathic treatments for vine grapes. Yay. Biodynamics involves planting, pruning, and harvesting wine grapes by lunar and other astral cycles, and sometimes marketing wine by the lunar calendar as well. It uses soil amendments called preparations or PrEPs, compost applications that resemble homeopathic medicines, These involve esoteric practices, such as those that you saw on the last slide, burying cow's horns packed with manure, or fermenting yarrow blossoms in a stag's bladder. I'm randomly showing you some slides from some of my trips to visit with biodynamic vintners. In December, I was in New Zealand, briefly off script. Cow pat pit is a technique for a kind of barrel compost developed by a New Zealand biodynamic specialist that's now used worldwide. It's been especially popular and effective in India. This is a cow pat pit in New Zealand. Practitioners sometimes describe the workings of biodynamics in terms of astral ethereal forces, which makes the scientific rationalists amongst us a little bit nervous, but bear with me. Biodynamic agriculture, which sees the farm or the vineyard as a self-sustaining living organism, was first proposed in 1924 by Austrian polymath Rudolf Steiner. He founded the Waldorf schools. Scientist, philosopher, clairvoyant. In a series of lectures to farmers who had already grown concern about the declining vitality in their crops and animals. This was in the years just following World War I, when chemicals produced for wartime armaments were first repurposed as synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. In 1928, the Demeter organization, named after the Greek goddess of agriculture, was founded to promote biodynamic agriculture, establishing the first certification for organic labeling. Demeter International now has branches in 45 countries. Along with the use of the PREPs and prohibition of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, Demeter regulations mandate that 10% of agricultural land for any given farm vineyard be set aside as forests, wetlands, etc., to encourage biodiversity within the self-sustaining farm organism. Many biodynamic practitioners use animal traction rather than fossil fuel, tractors, etc., and the animals themselves are incorporated into this sense of there being an interactive biological system. In fact, science and magic converged in the introduction of biodynamic agriculture to wine growing when French soil scientist Claude Bourguignon sampled the soil of some of Burgundy's notable domains, in many cases long since left to sharecroppers making heavy use of synthetic inputs. And in 1989, he announced that this hallowed ground had less microbial vitality than the sands of the Sahara. Meanwhile, Bourguignon had done controlled comparison trials using both biodynamic and conventional viticultural techniques with noteworthy results. Soon thereafter, several top Burgundian vintners began to adopt biodynamic practices. Rudolf Steiner trained as a scientist, aligning himself with the earlier scientific vitalism of the 18th and early 19th century Romantics, notably Goethe, whose scientific papers Steiner edited. Steiner described his own approach as spiritual science, in German Geisteswissenschaft, also using Goethe's wonderful phrase, the science of the supersensible, a science of things not perceived by the ordinary senses. In Oregon, biodynamic vintner Doug Tunnell grounds this aspect of biodynamics and of winemaking in general in microbiology. He says that for all winemakers, quote, there's a fascination with things that are not easily perceived or unseen. Biodynamic wine growing is well suited to winemakers. I mean, after all, what do winemakers do? Winemakers make wine with the help of yeast and bacteria, these little microorganisms that you can only see with a microscope and you don't understand exactly what they're going to do. In Doug's account, the vintner and a host of lively, unseen agents collaborate in creating a powerful life force through means that remain partly mysterious and only partly under the vintner's control. This is most evident in daily vineyard work through composting, a key element in the biodynamic wine grower's toolkit. As Doug says, making compost, in the first day or two of life, they come alive They're burning hot. They're 120 degrees inside because of the action of these microorganisms. I mean, it's a living thing. Living, breathing. The life force is really powerful. He's very excited at this point. And it's all kind of out of your control. I can't really control the temperature of that pile. I can't really control the action of the microbes. I mean, billions of microbes that are active in feeding my vines. The teeming mix of fungi, bacteria, protists, and amoebas in biodynamic compost and healthy soil sustains and is sustained by wine grapes and presents a reservoir of biodiversity that offers resilience, or perhaps, to use Anna Tsing's even more hopeful term, resurgence, in the face of anthropogenic threats to biodiversity and viticultural health. Healthy soil is a carbon sink, a key element in the toolkit for regenerative agriculture, along with cover cropping and the integration of diverse plants and animals in a closed-loop system of fertility. As microorganisms transform organic matter into humus, they help soak up the carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming. And as for the magical aspects of biodynamics, okay. As one writer puts it, the real magical thinking comes from the perspective of conventional agriculture. Or as this blogger says, still the real magical thinking emanates from conventional agriculture, including wine growing, where extensive applications of sulfur, herbicides, like Roundup and synthetic pesticides are used to push yields up. The magical part, pretending that the soil can survive this assault because there are many indications that it cannot. Thank you.
So if the velocity of novel hammers focuses wonder on specific nails, then my talk will celebrate older technologies of microbial wonder in the context of emergent hacking practices. Simon Park, a microbiologist and self-described outsider artist from England, recently hacked a Winogradsky column, and I'll tell you what that is in a little bit. He conducted what Delia Hanna calls a performative experiment, appropriating conventional scientific demonstration for the purpose of art and parody. He was trying to encourage people to think about how some kinds of bacteria are constantly taking up bits of foreign genetic material from the environment, incorporating the other into the self. In a blog post, Park wrote, "I've added my own DNA to this column, knowing that some of it will be taken up by the bacteria and integrated into their own genomes. In a sense, I've hacked this bacterial ecology, corrupted its genetics, so that it's now becoming a human bacterial chimera." Simon Park's hack simply involved extracting his own DNA from a blood sample and adding it to a giant graduated beaker, along with mud and water from a nearby creek. Winogradsky columns start out just like this. They're plain brown mud and clear water. The colors pop out as the columns age, as the microbial population dynamics emerge. And I might add that Anna does a Winogradsky beauty contest every year. So if anyone wants to listen to how this is made and submit your Winogradsky to the beauty contest, there's a judge in the audience. It was a vote. All right, not just you, a curator then. So these Winogradsky columns are used in Introduction to Microbiology courses, and if you can understand how a Winogradsky works, you can understand planetary microbial ecologies. So these involve population boom and bust cycles where diverse metabolic pathways enable some microbes to flourish in the waste left behind by others. They're named after this guy pictured up on the left, Sergei Winogradsky, who was a 19th century Ukrainian biologist who was one of the first people to study how microbes form complex communities and to consider how microbes contribute to global processes. In short, Winogradsky columns illustrate the worlding capacity of microbes, how diverse kinds of critters create niches for one another. Waste for one class of critter becomes life-giving nutrients for another. While humans have a poor understanding of these microcosms, our own lives and modes of being are contingent on the flourishing of these promiscuous and ubiquitous critters. It's easy to make a Winogradsky column yourself. Basically, you just go out with a bucket and collect mud and water from a pond or a river or an estuary And then you need to feed the microbial community, first of all, with a carbon source. So cellulose, which is in this paper here, or on newspaper, or in sawdust, cornstarch, or oatmeal, all work as carbon sources. But these sources are all going to release carbon slowly. So chalk is a source that'll get the community kicked off really quick. Calcium carbonate. So that releases carbon much more quickly and enables this rapid population growth. So if you look over to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see all these different pathways for making energy. So towards the top, you have organisms that use oxygen. Towards the bottom, you have those that don't. So you've got aerobic and anaerobic communities. You got some that are doing the work of photosynthesis. So the brown-colored organisms in the diagram are heterotrophic bacteria. So they're most like us in a metabolic sense. They use oxygen as energy and generate carbon dioxide as waste. The blue-green color that often develops at the top of the column comes from cyanobacteria, and these are some of the most abundant organisms on the planet that take CO2 out of the air and release oxygen. So the cyanobacteria, again, some of these most important and abundant organisms on the planet, also have a familiar mode of metabolism. Like plants and algae, they use plain old vanilla photosynthetic pathways, and they basically do that same work that the plants do. The purple and green bacteria in the column use alternate photosynthetic pathways that might seem strange to most land-dwelling mammals. They use sulfur to get energy from light and CO2. And you feed the Winogradsky column with a raw egg to give it sulfur for these communities. Other sulfur sources could include cheese, or you could buy it in elemental form, or as calcium sulfate. Other kinds of bacteria, which are generally found at the bottom of the Winogradsky column, also use sulfur, but in the absence of oxygen and light. Towards the top is yet another microbial community with its own metabolic pathway. Rust-colored bacteria make their living by catalyzing chemical reactions involving iron and oxygen. And you have to feed them with iron to make this community flourish. The purple community that thrives between the iron and the sulfur zones perhaps illustrate the ecological dynamics of Winogradsky columns most elegantly. They live in niches created by others, and they also generate a diversity of ferments that are used by microorganisms. So Simon Park added his DNA to this Winogradsky column, knowing that bacteria are constantly taking up foreign genetic material from the environment. It's popular knowledge that plasmids move around from bacteria to bacteria, but he's done some original research with Campylobacter, a very common genus of bacteria that's a leading cause of foodborne illness in the UK. And he found that when he was trying to manipulate the genetics of this organism in the 90s to see if he could add new genes into the bug, that it was super easy. The Campylobacter, you didn't have to do any fancy hack. You just sort of threw DNA in there and it would pick it up. So in 1997, he published those findings in the Journal of Bacteriology, noting, quote, the vector DNA became chromosomally integrated at random sites scattered throughout the Campylobacter genome. And more recently, other researchers have found that it's not just Campylobacter. Other kinds of microbes are also taking up this DNA constantly, incorporating new genetic material into themselves, experimenting with it, seeing if it's useful, discarding if it's not. In 2013, German researchers found that bacteria growing on this 43,000-year-old woolly mammoth bone had woolly mammoth DNA inside of themselves. The microbes were taking the DNA from this extinct animal and incorporating it into themselves. And researchers have found that short and damaged DNA is ubiquitous in most environments, and it can survive more than 500,000 years. After he hacked a Winogradsky column, Simon Park said that his DNA was integrated into the genomes of the bacteria, making up these interlocking communities. The microbes changed the meaning and the function of his DNA, he claims, repurposing and redirecting it, taking this code that makes a human being and turning it into something else. Dwelling on these images from Simon Park's hack offers new insight, I think, to Joseph Dumit's microbiopolitical dictum. Dumit insists, never think that you know all of the species involved in a decision. And he also adds, Never think that you can speak for all of yourself. The Winogradsky hack offers a way to reframe the ways that we speak and think about the microbiome, the companion species living in and on our body, the critters that make life what it is for humans, and vice versa. The Winogradsky hack also invites us to think of these critters inside of us not as aliens within our unknown inner space, but as our literal and figural kin. Microbes mediate modes of being human with their own ways of bringing forth a world. Tracing lines of flight away from human bodies, chasing after material semiotic elements that are constantly escaping beyond our corporeal boundaries, reveals that the human has become fractured and fragmented. To paraphrase Brian Rotman, our paraselves and parasites are becoming multiple, in parallel processes within an expanding milieu. Beyond our bodies, microbes do the work of channeling death back into life for multispecies worlds. The microcosm of this hacked Winogradsky might, in fact, serve as a post-human figure of hope. If the anthropos undoes itself in the Anthropocene, this geological era when human agency has been scaled up to embrace and endanger the entire planet, perhaps Homo sapiens will live on in a fragmented state within the bodies of others. Within microbial hackers who discover that some of our molecular parts are good to think and tinker with. Thanks. So I'd like to invite everybody to come up front. So some of you can sit up front and some of you can sit down here, but the folks who were part of the panel, let's try to get up front just like to change the geography of the room a little bit to facilitate discussion. And maybe, I guess I'll stand up here since I'm already here. Maybe as a first intervention, I'm going to ask some of the folks that were speaking this morning to respond to part of what Jesse said. So we've got the question from Rob on the table about the Microbiology Association, how to responsibly interact with microbes, how fear, awe, and the sublime might come into this. Kathy about this risk-averse culture, scientists who are afraid of artists. So part of what Jesse asked, and I'm going to ask Heather in particular, Jamie in particular, Anand in particular, to come up front. Whether you like it or not, I'm twisting arms. So Jesse talked about anthropomorphism, about agents with goals, about alliances, about this language of good and bad microbes. So I guess my initial response to Jesse about anthropomorphism, so I think maybe a dominant trope in the biological sciences is mechanomorphism, where a machinic nature, animals are assumed to have this machinic nature, microbes are assumed to have this machinic nature. I think more interesting tropes than anthropomorphism or mechanomorphism are like species-specific modes of grappling with these worlds, but maybe, Jamie, for starters, I'll just invite you to respond.
Yeah, I guess the point that struck me in relation to what Jess was saying, what I was saying, was about the basic phenomenology of the microbe. So we haven't really looked at what is or isn't inside or outside of that category. It very much relates to the scale of the human body and its conceptual apparatus. At various points around the day, we've had these kind of nice anecdotal reflections about the ways in which we become sensible towards the microbiome, or we learn to be affected by the microbiome. And I'm interested by this notion of the sublime. Kant was, if I'm right, writing very much in the context of kind of geological events, wasn't it? It was the earthquake in Portugal that was the most striking thing, and I guess at that period, the microbe was a non-event in that way, and there's a kind of malleability to the phenomenology of perception, so that we now come to take the microbe for granted, but whether it can have the same dramatic effect when it's mediated through a fairly complicated set of apparatuses to make it visible, I'm not sure. So I guess two points. One is just about the apparatus through which the micro becomes macro, if we accept that distinction about perceptibility. And then secondly, the degree to which the sublime has traction on the micro when it requires so many actors to make it visible. Those would be some comments.
Heather, do you have any initial thoughts? I'm going to pick on you since you because I can.
Just of what's been...
Maybe in particular in response to Jesse and some of the things he was saying about, is this language of agency critters with goals, alliances good and bad. Is that anthropomorphic, or is that
Right.
adding something? Or
Right. Well, I guess I would say one of the reasons many of us are talking about those things is because some of us anyway, as anthropologists, are interested in how other people are using that language, right? So it's not our language. But it's definitely language that's out there, and it's probably doing different things in different contexts and among different communities, right? And so I think many of us are really interested in whether it's anthropomorphizing, whether it's a sense of actually wonder and awe and humility in finding or looking for a vocabulary to talk about organic agencies that human projects of food making and health provisioning are working to direct or to guide or to manage perhaps, but certainly not to control. I think at least in the food world and I think other realms as well, some of that language of giving not just vitality, but maybe a sense of, call it agency, call it initiating relations, is actually reflecting a human humility, right, rather than the other way around. And I think that's interesting. So I don't think I think that language is becoming pervasive, but it doesn't mean the same things in every place. And I think our job is to try to sort some of that out.
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I was thinking about this problem as well as you were speaking, and I'm glad that Evan brought up the term tinkering, which is something that came up last night. Lévi-Strauss and the idea of the bricoleur, or the tinkerer, as a kind of figure that is in Lévi-Strauss's thinking somewhere between the savage and the scientist, and has a kind of sensibility that is akin to that of the artist. This is in the savage mind, and I think it's of interest here precisely because it forces us to ask the question: what exactly do we mean by putting some other kind of creature forward in terms that are familiar to us? Are we bringing them all the way over to the forms of agency we tend to valorize most, or are we actually finding some intermediate zone where the distinction between the kinds of action we reserve for ourselves and the kinds of action that we might reserve for beings unlike ourselves, or beings that are not capacitated in the way that we are, actually opens up? So very concretely, with regard, say, to something like hacking, one might simply ask the question, who or what is doing the hacking, and who or what is being hacked? And is it not the case that the hacking of the Winogradsky column is being done as much by the microbes that are making use of what is at hand, that as much as by the scientist who's throwing his DNA into the mix? And if that's the case, then is a form of activity like tinkering actually anthropomorphic? Is it geomorphic? I mean, how do we characterize this mode of practice that on the one hand we can identify with, but on the other hand seems to carry with it forms of activity that exceed the, they're not necessarily conscious, they're not necessarily deliberative, they don't necessarily involve the realization of a pre-formulated plan afterward in the world. So I think a lot of it depends on how exactly we figure this domain of activity in the first place.
Yeah. Thanks again, since everyone is liberally thanking you, and should, for organizing this and making it possible for us to have conversations across so many interesting disciplinary divides. That this whole question of agency for those of us who hang out in the science studies world and spend time working with scientists, I think brings us back to those wonderful phrases that are used within biology, the notion of the assemblage and the notion of consortia, where we're really focused not on individual actors, be they human or non-human, but on relations that cross species, that cross kind. And if we begin with that as the unit of analysis, if the unit of analysis is relational, that's the primary unit of analysis, then really we can set this question aside and move into seeing how things work together. That the assemblages that have to do with cheese or have to do with wine, with food production, or that have to do with making art, the homo faber category, humans who are making things, then becomes productive entities that are collaborative and that cross species lines. So your wonderful stratified columns are multi-species hacking encounters, right? It's the microorganisms and the structure of the column itself, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm definitely with you on part of that, but I want to keep provoking what Jesse brought up about life, because I think if we're going to go to the extent where we stop anthropomorphizing everything, we really have to say, well, what about the hacker that is the sunshine on the cyanobacteria, or the hacker that is that are the different minerals that bacteria are living on in this the Winogradsky column. So really bringing in non-life as well, because I think when you do make that hard divide between life and non-life, you're still perpetuating the need to, again, I come back to the word recognition, to recognize certain people or certain things, certain life forms as valuable and productive, and that's what we're striving for, something that can metabolize, something that has agency, something that maybe has some individuality, or even not, but something that is an actor and productive rather than destructive, or that just is. And so I think the danger of that, of course, is, and we were talking about this last night, the danger is, what do you do politically then if you say, like, oh, we don't have agency anymore, so why are we even studying this? Because now we should just go, like, I don't know, be hedonistic or whatever. But I think it's still important to consider that possibility and to look at what kind of politics could potentially come out of maybe, like really trying to take relationality seriously, but not just lively relationality, also the destructive forces. So I think about Elizabeth Povinelli in that, and also Elizabeth Wilson, who wrote Gut Feminism, which I just read.
I was just going to follow up to say, so from a community ecologist perspective, I mean, traditionally, when we think about mutualisms and this, when we think about the language we're using today, in the ideal scenario, we'd be measuring fitness benefits in terms of reproduction of both partners and the conditions under which those are positive or negative and the magnitude of those benefits. But the truth is, we have like 10 ecological systems in which those have been well characterized. And so, for example, acacia trees and the ants that live in them. We know a lot about how the ants benefit the number of offspring the acacia produce and the conditions under which that happens, and to some extent vice versa. But there are very few systems like that. And in that case, you have your, we would think like plus zero, plus, like who benefits, and then we'd have a number associated with them. But then when you move this over to these human domains, we're no longer really talking about fitness, right? Like that's not the variable we're interested in. We're not interested in, are these microbes benefiting the number of children we have and the number of children they have? And so somewhere, in this movement of this literature over into humans, the dependent variable changed, but the language stayed largely the same. And we lost hold of the ability to measure a bunch of the variables of interest to actually talk about, are these interactions really beneficial? And so when we talk about microbial interactions, we're almost always talking about short-term benefit in the context of some specific thing. And so I think I don't have more to say there other than that a lot happened in that move to humans of this language that I think as ecologists we're not very thoughtful about. I'll take that critique for sure. And this is fascinating in terms of thinking about that. And we can measure many dependent variables once we start thinking about that. And so, the richness of the experience of drinking wine and of that field, and how does that relate to something we can value? How does well-being fall into this, which is separate, very separate from fitness? And so when we talk about a good microbe, we're no longer saying good in terms of the number of children we have. We're saying in terms of all of these very different things. And as ecologists, we still use that same language, and we're super not conscious of that shift.
So we've actually been in the realm of anthropology and this multi-species studies conversation, been exploring a similar, like remarkably similar sort of question, like this question of who benefits, cui bono, but I think it has maybe a different valence in our conversation. It, I think is grounded in more of sort of the political economy kinds of questions, and by asking that question, the question is also who disbenefits. So, and maybe that's a question direct to Deborah, and to think maybe Heather too. Like, here we are enjoying these good cheeses and good wines, and how might we ask the question of cui bono in this commodity chain where there's certain kinds of labor, human and otherwise, that goes into this lovely meal we had last night?
Well, I mean, if we were trying to stick to the realm of the more than human, in the world that I've been paying attention to, the benefits to an immediate environment of desisting from using chemical inputs, it will let microorganisms thrive that will otherwise die. And I have slides that could have included some that have vineyards side by side, one of which is being farmed biodynamically and the other conventionally. And the conventionally farmed vineyard looks dead, and guess what? Partly it is. So in terms of who benefits there, before we move back into the human realm and talk about labor, the people working in the vineyard who are not being exposed to chemicals are benefiting. Labor costs are an issue that still need to be addressed. A shift away from large-scale agriculture back to smaller operations changes the nature of labor relations and mitigates the degree of human exploitation of other humans. That's not a universal, though. I discovered when I visited New Zealand in December that the largest pool of vineyard workers are groups of men primarily who come from Vanuatu. That's a fairly long distance away. It's on the same hemisphere. But in the U.S., Hispanic vineyard workers are still a large group, and they're mitigating activities. In Oregon, where I'm from, there's a group called Salon, run by winemakers who hold auctions to provide health care for the vineyard workers. Nonetheless, they're still not well paid.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add?
Just that, of course, fermented foods with wild fermentation, these are ancient peasant foods, right? So it's only super recent that they've been marked as, and of course, it's pasteurization, it's things like this that were necessary to scale up food production to large quantities and to work with large volumes of something as perishable and as vulnerable as milk is. When milk was pulled from many, many different farms, that, large-scale dairying and cheese making was not only enabled by pasteurization, it necessitated pasteurization, right? And so, in part, and in terms of Europe, there's been a continuous parallel tradition of the small artisanal raw milk cheese production in places like France and Italy, alongside, Laughing Cow, that's French, right? I always like to remind people that pasteurization and processed foods are as European as they are American. They just really displaced it in the United States in a way that didn't happen as fully in Europe. And now the current resurgence in artisan foods that we see now sort of really got going in the 70s with not hipsters but hippies, right? Who were not after a gourmet food. They were operating in critique of the industrial capitalist food system, and the food probably didn't taste very good, a lot of it. I shouldn't really say that. But, wine too, right? The hippie plonk. California had to overcome that. It was really hard for California to overcome that with the bare feet and all of that, right? So just in terms of putting the history back into it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's all.
I actually don't really understand how we can have this conversation of Biodynamic and talking about cheese without talking about the sheep or cows or goats who are being forcibly impregnated and then having their milk taken from them.
Do you want to respond?
I don't know.
It's okay like this? Yeah. It's more common to come back to the topic of anthropomorphism. Mm-hmm. Because I've got the impression that during the day we had, it's a very large category. And I think that we can distinguish at least 4 levels of anthropomorphism. There is a morphe, the similarity between two bodies. There is an anthropomorphism which is at stake with actions. There is another one which can be at stake with intention, and another one with process. And I think during the day we had a kind of vast array of possibilities, and every possibility is referring to a specific kind of human activity. No? And for instance, if you are trying to compare processes, obviously it's the technical processes that is the point of reference. If you are talking of a comparison between the body, you are using different kind of reference. So it was just to put together different kind of use of anthropomorphism that appears today.
It's a different point, but related to the cui bono question, and thinking about Anna Singh's book, which is a great book, and but in that she's trying to think about a kind of model of critiquing capitalism in relation to its intensities. I think she talks about disturbances, which are a necessary part of a kind of ecological model, but there are modes of excessively intense disturbances that are cross some tipping point, and she picks up on this kind of tipping point nonlinear ontology, which has become quite prominent in. And I've been trying to think this through in relation to the hookworm, where you get this really interesting story about presence and absence in the context of intensities. So the story of hookworm seems to be a story of colonial capitalism. So the kind of intensities of plantation capitalism tip a set of relations with hookworm across some threshold, and it then accumulates in a very negative fashion in populations, and you get high levels of malnutrition. And the countervailing story in the contemporary presence in the absence of hookworm is in some ways an equivalent tipping point across some threshold. And the temptation then is to think about some sort of return to some organic past in which everything was harmonious, which I don't think we want, but trying to think about a model of intensities in which there is some set of non-dysbiotic relationships between us and the microbiome through the operations of a kind of, it's very grandiose, but a kind of a history of capitalism. She offers some foundations there, I think, for thinking about that.
This was just a quick follow-up on that, just to say that one of the things that's interesting in Anna Singh's book and the articles that led up to it, she's also part of a collective that have studied the Matsutake mushroom and its various worlds and how it creates worlds, the worlding by the Matsutake mushroom. So these mushrooms, Jamie pointed out that they grow in disturbed areas. So areas that there's an area she studied, which is near where I live, that was covered by a volcanic mud flow in the 19th century, and it looks still sort of desolate. It's covered by urban gardening standards anyway. It's covered with lichen, that sort of thing, which is another life form that likes disturbances. But part of the point is, in a nonlinear way, disturbances can also create opportunities. And I think that this is part of it in the same way that Eben talks about emergent ecologies. What sort of new multispecies or microbial options are created by things that we might otherwise see as being pathological?
I just wanted to address the question that a couple of you raised before, because I think that it's a really key one here, and something that I think about quite a lot. And I think it's actually an impossible question to answer. So forgive me for kind of meandering around and not really doing a good job at it, because we have to start thinking about things like the rights of microbes in this, as well as the rights of cows and sheep and goats, and and on and on and on. And there have been a lot of, and I speak from an artistic position, or a position as an artist, I guess, that there are a lot of artists who've represented this, tried to look into the history of animals and what legal rights animals have had over history, in terms of like representing themselves in court and things like this. These kinds of policies sound ridiculous as you start to sort of talk about them in contemporary terms, but as we move into this era of the microbiome, I think that we'll end up at a point where we're starting to have to consider those kinds of issues too. These sound really esoteric, but I don't think they're actually going to be. And I think they will affect policymaking in some way. The question about animals is as I say, an impossible one, because, for example, I have a very good friend of mine who runs a sustainable cattle farm, where the cattle are eaten at the end of the line. The cows live like this really cool life. They go out, they eat grass all day. This is what cows do best. They have a great time. And then they're taken to a humane slaughterhouse, which I've been to these places. They're humane as much as they can be, but they're killed. The animals are killed at the end. And then we eat that meat, And so this is a process that not all of us, but many humans take part in. And I think that his attempt is to not only raise these cows well, he's also using those cows to fix the earth in this particular area where he lives. The cow poop, he has the most incredible grasslands on his farm that I've ever seen. So this is a cycle that is being repeated, that has been repeated for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And so that's his attempt to fix this cycle that you're talking about. Does that really fix it? I mean, I'm not sure that that's really the kind of answer, for example, that you might be looking for. I don't know if you have a particular thing in mind, or maybe you're vegan. But I think that that's something we have to start thinking about, is not only the lives of the animals and the representation of the animals, but how we as humans interact with our food consumption. in general. And I think that that's a lot of what the issues are coming up here with the discussions around cheese and the discussions around that. There's tons of, it's super complicated. So I really appreciate you bringing this up because I don't think there's an easy answer.
Just me and then Deborah.
Just a quick follow up on that. I mean, I think the cui bono question is problematic when we're talking about the microbiome for both terms. I mean, the notion of who is assigning a kind of agency and the notion of benefit also seems to be, in some sense, hedonic or related to a kind of, we immediately superimpose a notion of benefit that's relevant to our notion of benefit, which has to do with something experiential. We used to talk much more frequently, I mean, still in biology, it's done of microflora rather. Microflora, I think, introduces a different conceptual structure because when we think about plants, we don't think about them as who.
Unless you're Michael Martyr.
Huh? Yeah,
Unless
you're right.
Michael
One
Martyr.
might. And of course, there's a huge amount of very interesting, good work being done in environmental ethics where people are thinking about the status of plants. But I think part of the problem when we're thinking about who benefits, who's good, is that when we start to recognize that more than the cognizant, conscious beings matter in sustainability, then these old constructs of what counts as benefit need to be broadened. So I think we do need to be making these qualitative divides between the benefit of the cow or the sheep and the benefit of these microorganisms. And if we use the same vocabulary, we'll miss that. And if we miss that, we miss out on the important ethical questions, which are that in talking about an animal who has experience and agency, the issues there and Sophia talked about rights that they exert on us, the kind of second-person perspective you can have on an animal where you say, you are a being who suffers and experiences. What I'm doing to you is imposing something on you that's unacceptable and needs to be corrected in these ways. That's not a kind of question set that arises when we're talking about microorganisms. The questions that arise with microorganisms are really important questions, but they're a lot like talking about preserving plants and maybe even very different from those. So without drawing these distinctions between kinds of entities in the world, we end up kind of giving ourselves the wrong ethical frameworks to answer them.
I've got a rejoinder, but I think you were next in the queue.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that the stumbling block in what you're saying is being stuck in the notion of individual rights. That if we shift to a relational paradigm, we move beyond that. So if we're talking about your example of your friend's cattle farm is fantastic, and it's part of something I referenced briefly that's described as regenerative agriculture. The notion that we proceed in a way that will maximize good to many, right, across species lines. So if we move away from deep tilling, which releases carbon into the atmosphere, if we shift to grazing as opposed to CAFOs for the animals, which produce methane, which is another greenhouse gas, and we end up with animals that are treated humanely, meat that's healthier for us, right? Sorry, whatever we're going to say, kindly, compassionately. Animals who suffer less, at least, right? So in any case, I think that there are many benefits that we can reap by both thinking and living in a relational way.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think in a way that's what I wanted to express, that the ethics has to move beyond who benefits and be more inclusive. Relationality becomes an important part of that. The problem with who benefits is it limits the ethical domain to just the experiential. To say that that's a real aspect of the ethical domain that needs to be treated in ways that are different is all I had in mind. I'm struck by the fact that we used to talk about the micro organisms that live inside of us as invaders, Evan at one point used the term interloper, which is sort of they just happen to be sharing an ecosystem with us. And of course, a lot of the rhetoric now is about partners. And I think we've kind of shifted from this Cold War 50s science fiction invasion model, where there are these creatures inside of us, Day of the Triffids kind of thing, to the empathy model. We're living in this age of empathy, and it's like the ethics of empathy is so limiting, because it means that ethics has to be restricted to this kind of I can relate to you because your experience in the world is kind of like my experience. And so I think we tend to think of relationality and empathy as going together, but I think relationality broadens things out beyond empathy in ways that are really, really important.
But I wonder, though, whether some of these basic terms can be pushed a little further, again, than the way we're accustomed to thinking about them. So there's the question of the constitutive limits or the possibly constitutive limits of a rights-based framework, and whether it would confine us to the domain of individuals or discrete individuals or beings that we can recognize as individuals so that we can confer rights upon them. There's also the question that Sophie had posed earlier about this basic distinction between life and non-life, and whether we're again caught up in a certain kind of a set of basic limitations if our analytics are always sort of pressing us within this thing that we're calling life and all the different forms of agency or intentionality or activity or being that we ascribe to living beings. But then, of course, we have resources with which to think a lot of these things beyond the domain of the living. So there's this panpsychist tradition in philosophy that would tell us that mind is pervasive, that would tell us that that thought is pervasive, that would tell us that that mind may be better understood as the emergent outcome of an assemblage of some kind, rather than as the property of discrete individuals that are more or less like ourselves. Even if we take this term experience, for example, there are very peculiar ways in which, and interestingly peculiar ways in which it's been thought. So Alfred North Whitehead, for example, every actual entity for Whitehead is what he calls a drop of experience. And there's no distinction between entities, living entities and non-living entities, human entities and non-human entities. So I think we do have resources with which to kind of think through things like experience, things like mind, things like communication in ways that might actually unsettle some of these distinctions and might actually allow us to pursue projects of empathetic relationality in some pretty unconventional ways. The upshot of it for me really has to do with again, the kind of ethics of trying to tune ourselves to this thing called the microbiome. What, for example, if we were to call it the microsphere, rather than the microbiome, what that is if we were to circumscribe that domain, not in terms of its living beings exclusively, but the totality of elements, forces, beings, et cetera, that make possible the existence of a certain kind of world. What if we were to attribute to that microsphere capacities for living and thinking that might actually be mind-like in that emergent way, such that a Winogradsky column could itself be a thinking device, not an element by means of which a scientist thinks? That those kinds of questions for me begin to open up the problematic of sympathy, or sympathy perhaps even, maybe just empathy, in far more expansive ways than I think we're accustomed to using those.
Rose has hand up, Anna, and we're going to have to wrap up soon, so if anyone has a lingering question, let's try to get them all on the table, even if we can't resolve them.
Yes, I'll just quickly introduce some history in the context of both of these comments that I think is interesting, which is that the microbiome, using that language is new, and the introduction to the human literature is new in its accelerated form. But the field is really, really old. And cows are a great example here, because rumen ecology, I mean, there was great work being done in the 1900s, and the first fecal transplants in cows were in the 1940s. And so, but the language was different. And the rhizosphere is fascinating in this regard, right? The rhizosphere is dead because now it's the root microbiome. And it's because people working on humans introduced this term that was borrowed from the literature in biomes reused in a way that shed itself of what we traditionally thought of as the biome, focused on the genes, and so did away with some of the concepts that you would actually like to see attributed to it, which historically we did. The human literature is then so massive relative to everything else that this language then swept through all the other literatures and colonized to anthropomorphize the literature, right? And so I think that's a fascinating element here, that the empathy in thinking about ourselves and microbes is totally new. It's not totally new. It's new. It's the newest place. But for cows, it's not. And so the cow people makes them furious, right? We did all this. Like, why are the people keep saying they invented this? I'm like, well, nobody talks to the cow people. Why don't they talk to the cow people?
Class.
Yeah. And
Class.
So, I think there is that element. Yeah.
I mean, it was just a quick point that actually microbiome is a term that's often misused. It refers to the genome of that, and what you're actually talking about most of the time is the microbiota. So
that's a misuse of the original term of microbiome, because the microbiologist, the geneticist who coined it, didn't understand the original use, and so they coined it wrong. If there's a wrong, they coined it different from the.
So who used it originally?
So the first use is the pigpen dust guy who died a couple of years ago. His name I'll think about in a second. No,
He remembered like that. The pigpen dust guy.
He's always quoted this saying that we're immersed in our dust of microbes. And so then Rob Knight was the second use.
They
The
used
first
the
use
actual
was
phrase.
yeah.
But commonly now it's used to refer
Yeah,
to the
absolutely.
genome, the whole field that we're talking about.
That
It's about the
one, so
genomics
now,
of the microbiome, and it wouldn't be a research field if it wasn't for genome sequencing technology, because we wouldn't have any access to it, and we'd be in the situation of poor Sergei Vinogradsky, considered a madman in his day, and mispronounced a lot today.
I don't know if it's true though, but I mean the cow rumen people were doing culture-based work, and this was and is a rich field, all based on culture-based techniques before the sequencing.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, there's not crosstalk and probably even cross-reading between agricultural science and the state colleges versus what's done here. They're trained in different schools. They got different genealogies, and that's basic.
And thank you all for coming. And in particular, I'd like to give a round of applause for Laura and Raj, who are sitting in the back, who made all this happen. And I'm going to disappear out the back door because I've got another engagement in Brooklyn. So feel free to linger, talk amongst yourselves. I'm going to say bye now, so you won't get a personal bye. But thank you.
Thank you.